Welcome to a new Marketing Insights with Luan and Laura. We are recording this session before it plays out in September. Hopefully it will... I don't know what to say. Should we just do intros first?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we will start.
You're overthinking.
I know. It's because it's pre-record. It's harder because you think, don't keep going, just stop. Okay. Welcome to a new Marketing Insights with Luan and Laura. If we haven't met before, my name is Luan Wise. I am a marketing consultant and practitioner working across lots of industry sectors from manufacturing, education, FMCG, and also do teaching training on my specialist area, which is social media.
And I'm Laura Chamberlain. I'm a professor of marketing at Warwick Business School at the University of Warwick, and I'm the founder of Talk, Think, Do Group. And together we've come to share our insights into marketing. We've rebranded our series, and this is a pre-record because I am currently on maternity leave. So for obvious reasons, I am currently not available at the time that this goes out. I will very much not be available so Luan and I have decided to do some pre-records to give you and share with you our marketing insights moving forward. We're very much taking the live format though, aren't we, Luan? So this is not one that's going to be messed around with and edited. It takes very much the format of the live series that we've already done and we'll be doing moving forward, so it's very raw.
Yeah.
But we wanted to keep things going and share some thoughts with you guys.
Yeah, the ethos was, when this started, was you and I talk often and about what I'm doing in industry, what you're doing with your students, and learning and theory and exchanging ideas. And we thought that people might be interested in listening in to our conversation. So we record as if no one is watching, but hopefully there will be some.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. So this is
very rough around the edges.
Yeah, very. But we have planned some topics, and the first topic to play in September, we thought this was really good timing as well, is to talk about learning and how, obviously, in our worlds, learning is really important to us both. You in terms of formal learning, I call myself a lifelong learning, always have a stack of books and reading and researching and keeping up to date. So we thought we would focus today's subject around learning, what it means, share some insights and observations from a recent conference, well, recent as in June, for when we're recording this, a conference where we got together, you ran a session, I attended some sessions, all about learning in practice, and to start sharing with you some research that we have been working on since the end of 2019. We started this and we've talked about it a lot, and we are finally ready to start sharing the results. Should we start with the conference? Do you want to
let's start
your session?
So we were at the Academy of Marketing conference. The Academy of Marketing is a membership organisation mainly for marketing academics, but practitioners are always welcome. And it's our annual conference. So for full disclosure, I'm the chair of the education committee for the Academy of Marketing, so I'm very heavily involved with that organisation. And you've been to a couple of our conferences now, haven't you, Luan? And the most recent one was in early July this year.
Yeah.
Oh, you said June earlier, but it was July, wasn't it?
First week of July, yeah.
First week of July, yeah. That's when it always is. I should know that. And so I really love going to conferences because not only is it a great opportunity to catch up with people, people in your network, meet new people, but the way this conference is structured, particularly, that there's a real interesting mix of sessions. So there's practitioner speakers, there's research papers, so people's current research that they present on. People talk about their teaching activities, and we even had this year a panel discussion where we invited academics and the Chartered Institute of Marketing to come and talk about AI in terms of marketing practice and marketing teaching. Obviously, that's a massive hot topic at the moment, moving forward. So it's a nice conference because it's really varied. Like, it's not one format that's across the whole conference. And I love it because it's time out of the day-to-day to think. So I'll listen to things and I'll hear people talking, or I'll have conversations, and it usually sparks ideas and stuff like that. And I know we had loads of chats at the conference, and you had chats with lots of different people as well. And it's just that time just to think. I often find I don't get day to day, so I really relish the opportunity to go to conferences for that, if nothing else.
And what's so different about this conference for me as a practitioner is, yes, it is very academic led and the subjects are academic, but I enjoy that. But I love, as you said, the breadth of the conversations, but also how each session tends to be a presentation by more than one person. So it's on a theme, but various insights. And then the questioning afterwards, the feedback, or the where are you going next with this, or these are our experiences in our institution. And I think what's wonderful about higher education is that you all share with each other about your students and your experiences and others, and take away those insights and learning opportunities as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess in a commercial context, when I've been to sort of very industry focused conferences, there's always that guard. Of course, you're never going to give away the stuff that's commercially sensitive or that's your USP and all that kind of stuff. Whereas in higher education, we're all sort of aiming towards the same goal. And of course, technically universities are in competition with each other. It's a different framework. But because we're academics, that idea of the building blocks of knowledge and sharing in order to learn and all that kind of stuff just really runs through as a thread. So it's a very different vibe, a very different feel to a lot of the commercially focused conferences that I've attended and been to. And I guess that's why learning is such a big theme. Not in necessarily just the traditional academic research sense, but just as a general approach, like learning from one another and the power of conversations to help learning, and the sharing of ideas and giving constructive feedback to help other people develop their ideas. So there's not really that sense of, oh, you might steal what I'm talking about. It's kind of like, well, I want to talk to you about it and get your feedback on it so you can help me develop my ideas to be better. There's an inherent kind of trust element to the process there around feedback, which is really quite unique and interesting to academia in some ways.
And I think what's great about it from my point of view is how you have these events and talk about it, but also how the thread that sits behind a lot of this is obviously the student experience, and how can you help them, and how can we benefit them, and within a changing context as well. Like, one of the sessions I went to was about placements and how everything around placements has changed, and how it's harder for some students, particularly because of COVID and work changes, and the importance of placements and what that means and what they need to get out of them. And so there's always the student and the learning experience at the forefront of these papers and improving. And like you said, the AI, that is changing the learning experience and what that means. And for you all to come together and have those conversations and exchange ideas, I think is just amazing.
I was just thinking, as you were talking then, like, student experience is always front and center. As soon as you talk about anything to do with employability, to do with teaching and learning, in that regard of the job. So it's moving away from sort of the traditional academic research, but as soon, students are front and foremost, which, as it should be, because we're marketing academics, so our customers really should be. Marketing is all about customer orientation, marketing 101, so it really should be at the front and center. But it's amazing how often that can get lost. But thinking about what things look like from our students' point of view, the experience that they're having, and how we can make that better, not just in terms of their time at university, but beyond, is just absolutely paramount at the moment. The conversation it's an exciting conversation to be part of, actually, because there's some really cool stuff happening, and some innovation and ideas that people are having to really push things forward, which can only be a positive thing.
Yeah, and well, as you said, there's such a mix of sessions as well. So there's the sessions around teaching and practice, but also where people are presenting their own research papers. The fact that while you're teaching and engaging with students, you're doing your own research projects and your own interests as well, and exploring those and what that means. And there was such huge breadth. I look at the agenda and pick out ones that are just, I find fascinating, or I think I might find interesting. And some were on sustainability, some were on how things have changed when you're working from home, one about charity marketing and what that means and how that's been influenced. So to hear the research interests and for different academics with similar interests to come together in that thread and listen to each other and then share ideas as well is really cool.
I think one of the ones that a couple of presentations I attended that really struck out to me as well were the efforts that's being made to break down the boundaries around higher education. So working with people in different communities, really sort of engaging with local communities, for example, or initiatives to do with the arts. So it's not just working in the ivory tower of a university, it's working with organisations and with people outside of the university context, not just in terms of conducting the research, but then also the impact of that research and how it's changing things outside the quote-unquote walls of a university. And there's a real shift, I think, in terms of thinking about how academic research sort of plays out in the outside world. And I don't really want to talk about inside and outside worlds in that sense, but I'm using it as a shorthand, you know what I mean? Like it would be really easy for things to be in the academic sphere and stay there, whereas actually, like, what's the point of doing lots of research if it's not having an impact outside of academia as well as within? So I think there was some really interesting conversations that are being had around what people are doing, and there's some amazing work being done at universities that are really investing in their local area and what they're doing and how they're helping marketing and customers and various initiatives in different localities across the UK and beyond. So I thought that was really cool. There's some really nice presentations around that.
Yeah, it was, I loved it. It's Cardiff next year, I think.
It is, yeah.
And I will just take this opportunity to share that during the AGM, there was a mention of a podcast that I've recorded with Fran Hyde from University of Suffolk, which we talked about integrating practitioners into education and sessions. So we exchanged ideas of what she was looking for from practitioners and my thoughts on what you need to know and ask, everything from, who's the audience, what's the topic, to don't forget that you need to allow plenty of time to find a car parking space on a university campus and get to a lecture theatre, and are you going to be left alone, or are you going to do a Q&A with the students and recorded? So that was really nice to launch that session that Fran and I had recorded as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the topics that's very dear to both your and my heart, bridging academia and practice, and how we can facilitate much more collaboration across the board between what's happening in universities and what's happening in industry. One of the things that I hear that upsets me is comments like, I've never used anything that I learned at university or in the real world. Or what's the point of a marketing degree and all that kind of stuff. So and I think there are, of course, cases where we can be better at bridging academia and practice, but there's also a lot of really cool work that's going on in order to do that, to facilitate that, and to have academia reflect practice, but also practice learn from academia and reflect what's happening in terms of cutting edge thinking and research, credible research and thought leadership in that sense as well. So I guess that's kind of feeds us back round to the topic for today around learning. We haven't practiced this, by the way. This is
I will. So I'm going to interrupt and just say, the things you hear and what's been wonderful when I've done guest lectures for you and others is to see other students' faces going, oh, that's what my lecturer said to me, and this does actually happen in the real world. You're like, this again, this wasn't rehearsed, but yes, we do use personas, we do use these models, and there's things that I studied a while ago that perhaps aren't used. Social media didn't exist when I studied, but those theories are still relevant. So hopefully there is a continuity thread that does go through.
I think when you're teaching as well, so I'm not their mum, of course, but there is that kind of almost thing like, yeah, you know, Laura said this, but as soon as somebody else from outside comes in and says the exact same thing I've said,
yeah,
but like you're actually working in the real world and I'm just the professor at the front of the room. It's like the person who's actually from industry saying this thing as well. They're like, oh right, okay, yeah. Like, I just told you that. So, but I think that can only help, and I think more voices singing from the same hymn sheet makes a lot more sense. You know, if we're all sort of saying, and this is what it looks like, and if you have a theory or a concept, and I've given them the foundation, but then practitioners like yourself can say, well, in my context, this is what it looks like, and somebody else might say, well, in my context, this is a variation of what it looks like. That then starts to give a more holistic picture of the application of concepts and theories, which it can only be a benefit and a bonus.
Yeah, and I think there's also something for practitioners around, if you are asked to do a guest lecture or a talk or a webinar about anything, it makes you stop and think about, how do I do things? What was behind that? How did I measure it? And it's almost like that, like you said, going to conferences, of having that time out to think of the prep time of going, I need to talk to a room full of people about things I do. How do I do it? And what do I need to do? And how does this work?
But that moment of reflecting on why, right? Because quite often, as a practitioner, and I do have one foot firmly in practice, so I don't just teach and research marketing, I do some as well. It's really easy to almost fall into the trap of like, oh, I know how to do it and this is how I do it. But that reflection on why and how that why has developed over time, you don't necessarily ever articulate that. So what a lot of people find when they come and do a guest lecture, or we do like a fireside chat, and I'm saying, well, why do you do something this way, and things like that. It's a really interesting reflection moment on how that why has developed, and really thinking about the fundamental principles that are being used that have developed into an approach, and that's quite cool.
Yeah, and you just question yourself. We're going to come on to this, and this is so I've been writing my book. There's the front cover, out in October, but behind the book is research, and we'll talk about that in a second. But as I was writing, it was kind of like, you know, I'm writing what I know, and then you start questioning yourself, and it's like, I know this, but how does that one work together with this one, and what does this actually mean in practice, and I need to check that. So it is that kind of relearning and questioning yourself as to why you're doing things and what you can do better, and as you're going to explain it to someone else, you're like, oh, actually that's a really good idea, I should probably do that myself as well.
But also, just to pick up on a point there, when you said do better, for me that's all around mindset as well though, right? It's like growth mindset, it's all the fundamental principles of not being stuck in your ways, around thinking about how you can improve, about learning from when things have gone well and when things haven't gone so well. And I guess that kind of flexing that feedback muscle in lots of different ways is really important, and not just sort of being on the hamster wheel of doing, and building in that time for reflection, thinking, and like you said, questioning yourself so that you can grow and develop, but then also taking on new knowledge, you know, like reading your book, of course, you know, to it's a process. And you started off by saying, you know, you're a lifelong learner, and I think by default I am as well.
But I think it's important to recognise that learning can take many shapes. So I'm starting to think about how we move on and talk about the research. Is that our conversations, every time we talk, I learn something and end up sharing, oh, and this happened to me, and this happens, and I know that we both come away with like ideas buzzing, because we can take away thoughts. And so learning is about the people that you surround yourself with, and making sure that you have those conversations. And that is why I think the conference for the last 2 years has been going back to face, and the importance of not just that sitting in the room listening time, but the cup of coffee and the introductions and everything else, and really valuing how important that is in keeping learning and our options open and our minds going as well.
100%, yeah.
Yeah.
Should we talk about the research?
Yeah, because this happened, didn't it? I think it was a regular, bearing in mind this was 2019, so it was like, can I come up? Can we have a coffee and a catch up? So we were in Warwick Business School cafe drinking coffee, and you asked me what I was up to, and I said, I think I need to start working on the second edition of the book I self-published in 2016. Started talking, and then you suddenly opened your laptop and started typing away, which is what you do.
This is what I do, yeah.
Yeah, and said, let's research this. Let's dive into this.
We did, yeah.
We did, and I said that I wanted to write the second version of the book, which, as you will notice and has been announced now, it has a different name from Relax, It's Only Social Media, because actually it turned into something completely different, based on the research that we did together and the direction that I wanted to take the book. So it is a second version, but a completely different version, because I wanted to explore some of the areas that I had conversations and feedback on since the first book. I'd done a lot more teaching and training and insights working with companies, but wanted, I think your words were, robustness and to check this, and that's why we went down the research route.
Yeah, and I think as well, where everything was in 2016 compared to 2019 was very, very different. And obviously now, the magic of hindsight, where we are now in 2023 compared to when we had that conversation in 2019.
Yeah.
I mean, when we had that conversation, we could never have predicted all the things that have happened in the interim. And we don't need to labour the point about everything that everybody's been through in the last number of years. But it has flipped everything on its head again. And I think one of the things that allowed us to do, which was kind of played into our hands almost, was we took a snapshot research-wise in 2020. So we had the conversation, I opened my laptop and we got to work. And so we had a data collection point in 2020. And then we did a second run of data collection in 2022. And that allowed us to see where things had shifted and changed, and interestingly where they hadn't. Now there's always a caveat here around, we have a relatively small sample. I mean, it's actually a decent sample, and they were different samples. We didn't use the same people at each data collection. But in terms of an overview of looking at what we were seeing anecdotally, and then backing that up with a comparison between our data sets, we could see that there were things that were shifting and changing across that period for inevitable reasons, but also some quite surprising results as well, and some really positive trends that we saw as well, the things that were reassuring. And I guess just thinking back to your 2016 version of your book to where we are now as well, because of those positive trends and the way that people have changed in terms of the way that they're thinking about social media and approaching social media, and some of the things that haven't changed, I think the refocusing of your book really sort of encapsulates all of that as well, in many ways. Yeah.
So we are going to record a separate session on a lot of the data. We're not going to share it all in this session because we'd like you to watch again. But the research itself was a mixture of interviews, but also some quals, some qualitative interviews, recorded Zoom conversations, anonymized afterwards. And so what I wanted to do today, Laura, was share with you some of the quotes that came up during those quals, but caveated around. One of the questions was, I don't have time to learn about social media. And the response to that was almost a perfect 50-50 split on, I agree, I don't have time to learn, versus, yeah, I do have time to learn. And in the quals, we talked about how people learn about social media, and most of the answers were no formal training, learning as we go, attending conferences, and some really interesting kind of thoughts that went around those. So I've put some of them on a slide that I thought we would talk through. Here we go. I'm going to start with one which was quite interesting around learning and expectations of social media understanding within an organisation. And this, I think, is a good place to start off. I would expect a graduate to have learned how to use social media.
Yes. No. Yes and no. So this is a really interesting one because there's a couple of things that are wrapped up in here. There's always an assumption that young people equal social media for starters for 10. We can talk about them being digital natives and being across all the different platforms and all that kind of stuff. So again, that's a massive assumption in many cases. But the thing that I would start with here is, yes, if you've got a graduate who's done something in marketing, you would expect them to know the fundamentals around social media for sure. But at university, we don't teach tactics. We teach a lot around fundamental principles, around theory, around research and concepts. And part of the reason for that is if you have, say, an undergraduate doing a 3-year degree and they are taught social media tactics in year 1, by the time they've graduated 3 years later, they might be out of date.
Well, Laura, I could teach you, sorry to interrupt, I could teach you some tactics now as we're recording. By the time this plays out, it will all have changed.
Yeah. So yes, you can expect people to have fundamental principles around strategy, around understanding the cohesive bigger picture. But in terms of tactics or certain programs or software or platforms, less likely. Now, I want to caveat that by saying, as part of some assessment, you may have had a student who's run an Instagram campaign and has learned about a certain suite of metrics. Interestingly, when I teach metrics, for example, I talk about the principles. So if we talk about, I don't know, a certain metric, I'll talk about the theoretical underpinnings of that metric, why it works, when it does work, when it doesn't work. But in terms of what that looks like in terms of a dashboard, I don't teach that because everybody's dashboard's different and all that kind of stuff. So so there is a little bit of a gap there in terms of this expectation that this person was obviously talking about in terms of what a university can give and the foundations that they can give, but also what needs to be layered on top of that. And tactical training isn't really something that universities will often engage with in a wholesale sense. And when I read your book, because I have been privileged enough to read a full copy of the book already, that's something that comes out really strongly in your book, is that you have to have those fundamental strategic underpinnings in order to deliver on the tactical side of things. And I know that's something that you really strongly believe in as well. And I think, I know you've got views around how fast things change, which you just alluded to there. So I don't know if you want to talk about that.
This was so when I went to my first Academy of Marketing conference 12 months ago, and I was nervous. I didn't know how a practitioner should interact in this environment, but it was this very question that I did stick my hand up to give some feedback on, because this was discussed to a certain extent as a subject area, and my gut response to this was, yes, I completely agree with this assumption and have seen this statement many times. I believe the gap is around the expectations and the people having the expectations, and how the skills that the graduate needs to learn is questioning and managing upwards and asking for the brief and asking who the audience is and what the messages are and what does success look like. And the expectation then is for the line manager, the business owner working with the graduate doing the social media, gives them the full picture as well of knowing what that is. So I think there's an expectation gap and assumptions, which we know is hugely dangerous. We can't deny that this exists. I think it's about how people in practice and graduates and everyone else kind of understands what that really means, which leads on to one of the other quotes that was on a similar line, that when in industry, that it is perhaps a graduate or a junior marketer, it becomes very focused then on outputs rather than impacts, because it's all about tactics and quick wins and and things, rather than what's the bigger picture that things align to.
Yeah, and I think again it's an interesting one, because that impact piece for me fits into that strategic piece around understanding the bigger picture, and how what you're doing fits into the business plan, for example, and understanding the importance of those things, rather than focusing on how many follows or likes, or how many times you posted in a week, or things like that. And I think it's very easy in social media particularly to kind of get caught up in a narrative around output.
Volume.
See it happen quite a lot, as you do as well. But also it feeds into wider strategic things around thinking about the long term, like a brand build, for example, where you may see bumps in terms of followers or likes, but what does that actually mean outside of that bubble? And also the conversation around, what's the point of social media? So you can have situations where you have, how many followers, how many likes, but if it's not converting into sales, if that conversion isn't there, then you're not really delivering on what you need to deliver, which that depth of understanding, I think, gets lost when you're output focused rather than impact focused.
Yeah, and this wasn't just one quote. This came up many times in the qual interviews, both in 2020 and 2022 as well. So it is a common thread. One of the other, as I was exploring the learning, was around, where do you learn and how do you learn, and, qualifications in this and not. And it then came on to the breadth of social media as a role, and someone saying working in social media involves lots of transferable skills. They didn't necessarily have a business degree or a marketing degree. They could have English and want to be a copywriter. They could have done sports science or maths, but be brilliant at the data analytics and insights. Which also, just to pick up on one of the other quotes at the same time, is we talked about the future and what does that look like, and the questions were around, is it a specialist job in the future? Can it all be done by one person with a really broad skill set, or actually is it something where we have specialists, or is it something that's embedded into all roles within an organization, marketing and outside marketing?
I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, I'd be interested, do you think it's a specialist role or embedded?
I think it requires knowledge in terms of tactics, what's going to work, what's not going to work. My answer is always going to be, it depends. It depends on the resources that you've got available, because the thing that I hear most often about marketing and particularly social media is this almost this chip, this bug around, we could be doing more, we could be. And I think that's the biggest challenge. So yes, you could all be doing, and it could be a specialist role, but sometimes your business doesn't justify that level of investment in it to get the return on it. As much as I'm a big fan, it is not the only marketing tactic channel, and may not be everything that you could be doing. Other things can work harder. So I think absolutely it could be specialists. We could have specialists of different platforms, of different content types. I also advocate that actually it's something that should be embedded into everyone's mindset, and because at the moment, and again, this was another quote, it can't just be, oh, I finished something, let's pop it on Twitter. I've done something, let's make sure it goes out on LinkedIn. At the moment, social media, even in 2023, is still a bit of an afterthought for some organizations. So I think it needs absorbing, professionalizing, and embedding in terms of thinking. But again, that's where we perhaps need to separate out the thinking and the implementation as well.
Yeah, and I think there's something there around who drives the strategy, who has ownership. There is a danger if it's embedded into all roles that it becomes that element becomes diluted, which is problematic. But actually, on the flip side of that, thinking about how it can be embedded, it's not thinking about social media, it's about thinking about what we want to share, so what the content is. And so what your audience would find interesting, useful, / whatever it is you're trying to achieve. And so often the embedded part is people sticking their hand up and saying, I've got this, or I can do this, or I could do that. And I saw something recently, random tangent here, where there's a CEO of an agency who once a month gives his LinkedIn over to an employee, and they do posts on his LinkedIn profile, because obviously he's got massive reach. And it's just a really interesting way of thinking about that idea of content and mixing it up a little bit, and getting everybody to think about what messages they want to send out, not as individuals, but as an organisation, but to showcase the different people in their workforce, the variety, the diversity, raise profiles of certain people because of the jobs that they do, things like that. So it can be really simple stuff that then moves beyond the boundaries of one person or a small team's role, which is social media. And that's where the embedded stuff can really work really nicely, I think. In terms of the transferable skills, I mean, marketing generally, I talk a lot about this, transferable skills and the marketing skill set. There's a massive piece of work that I'm doing with some colleagues around the skills that marketers need. And I talk a lot with my students about their skill development, and the majority of modules that I teach, I talk to them about what the skill is that I'm helping them to develop when we're doing certain things. So I will always talk to students about how empathy is really important in marketing, in terms of understanding your customers, for example. How do you teach empathy? I mean, that is a question that I have been wrangling with for quite a while. And myself and some colleagues are doing a lot of work on things like creativity, empathy. How do you bring that to life? How do you help students develop those skills as part of their university education, but also be able then to transfer them into different contexts like social media? And I think social media is so interesting because there are so many skills that are required. And you've got copywriting and data up there as two examples, but there are many more, and in some ways I would say that people don't recognize those skills as important or give them the gravitas. Like, social media doesn't have gravitas attached to it in many ways by many people. People see it as like an add-on or a fun thing that young people do. It's actually really complex, really difficult, and there's a huge amount of skill behind getting it right and delivering really on a really good social media strategy. So I think raising that conversation around the skills that are required is quite an interesting way of thinking about what it is we're trying to achieve and how we're going to get there, and lending some of that credibility and gravitas to social media as a function, discipline, area, however you want to term it, I suppose.
Which for the last quote box on here for us to talk about was when I then started exploring, okay, we need to learn, there is a need to learn, where do we go to learn? The other challenge was, where do we go to learn about this, especially something that is changing so much? And the challenges around that was, someone said this, I don't know where I would look. Some people quite often turn to their professional bodies for learning and CPD and everything else, but which one owns this? Because within organizations, social media can sit in very different places as well. Sometimes it is in a marketing function, sometimes it's comms, sometimes it's product marketing. That there's, again, so many challenges around where it sits. How do you learn? And actually, a session I've done this week, someone said, but we don't know what we don't know, so we don't know what we need to go and learn as well. So the learning challenges, perhaps you can wrap up with some advice on how to learn when you don't know what you don't know.
How do you know when you don't know what you don't know? Excuse me, sorry. I mean, talk about a question. Well, peers is always a good starting point, I think. You're always going to nod at that. Do you want to talk about your learning network before I launch into?
I think one of the most valuable things that I do as an individual is I have conversations with people like yourself, but also my peers. And when it's an informal conversation, just talking about what you've come across, what you've found, it's something that kind of comes out more informally, perhaps, than sitting there going, I don't know how to run ads on this platform, and having that chat around what's challenging you, or what is the challenge and where do you go to find it out. So my learning networks are communities, whether that's I'm a fan of Facebook groups to see what people are asking about. I'm a big fan of Guild as a communities platform to ask questions and answer questions as well. Other kind of learning alumni communities, I love to see what questions people ask. I learn from the questions that other people ask about presentations and things like that. So I would say perhaps my learning is picking things up informally and then going away and diving in to find them.
Yeah, and I think there's something nice there around knowing that you're asking questions that other people are interested in as well.
Yeah,
for sure. I think I would add on to that, because sometimes it's hard to know where to start.
Yeah.
And so social media, funnily enough, is a great place to start in terms of listening into conversations that people are having. What are the hot topics? Looking for key opinion leaders in a particular field. So in marketing, for example, there are some obvious ones. But actually, one of the things that I am really keen on, and it's something as part of Talk Think Do Group, which is my company, excuse me, which is all about empowering achievement, is about figuring out how to empower achievement and people's learning. And so I am a big advocate of people figuring out a strategy and an approach to this, and almost setting out their own learning program. So if there's an element of something that you know you want to improve on, so say social media tactics, there are lots and lots of resources, and it's about cutting through the clutter and how do you figure out which are the ones that are most useful. So that's where looking for things that are recommended, and you will see people like myself who will give recommendations around, you know, where to start. But then also seeking out information. So there's tons of like free webinars and information sessions and readings, blog posts that can be done. And I think part of the work that I'm looking at doing is how do you empower people to curate through that, really, to almost fashion your own learning program. Once you start, it snowballs, which can feel a little bit overwhelming, I suppose, in some ways. But there are always starting points. And I think when you learn, there's also the power and point of reflection. So what have you found interesting? What have you learned from something? It's not just about acquisition of knowledge, it's about applying it to you and what moves your needle. So also helping people to find what they're passionate about, and knowing what doesn't do it for you. So if you've sort of learned about something and you think, well, this just leaves me cold, that's just as powerful as finding something that really does excite you and help you find your passion, because that then helps you follow a path to figuring out, you know, where you want to go next and what you want to do. But being open-minded behind all of that is really important. But the crux of it really comes to time, making sure you carve out the time to find things, read things, have those conversations. That can be really, really hard to do. One thing I experimented with this last year was having a standing appointment in my diary. So I had two. I had a reading hour and I had a journaling half hour. And I was really exploring this idea of journaling as a professional journaling as a tool, and it's been so helpful. And I actually had a standing half hour in my diary to do that each week, and I had a standing appointment for a reading hour that I fiercely protected. And so what I would do, I have a reading list. I have a constant stack of books, and I would literally sort of just make sure that if I managed to do no other learning that week, I had at least 1 hour where I'd done some. So just tricking yourself in your diary in some ways into fitting it in.
It's making it a habit, isn't it? So I'm a big fan of reoccurring appointments, but also my reading time is I get up in the morning, I make a cup of coffee, I sit down with a book and I read my book before anyone else is up or talking or TVs or radios on. And so I have at least 30 minutes every day to read, and then I do find other time as well. But yeah, it's making it it's making it part of a habit, isn't it, rather than
absolutely. And it's about figuring out what that looks like for you. I mean, I love the idea of waking up and reading for 30 minutes, but the shout of mummy is usually what is my wake up call. And once that cry comes out,
it'd be a very different type of book that you're reading at 7:30 a.m. to me.
Maybe reading, a very different type of book, but it's not one that is
we should WhatsApp, what are you reading this morning?
I have to think about other ways of fitting it in. But again, format is really important as well. And I listen to loads. I know loads of people are into Blinkist, so the short versions of books. Audiobooks. I know you're going to be recording. Well, we will have recorded by the time this goes out your audio version of your book as well, and just linking into webinars. Use your lunch times as well. If you have lunch times and things like that, it becomes really important. So there's always a way.
There's always a way. And we both curate resources, and I would say, yes, this is pre-recorded. There's not a live chat, but if you are looking for recommendations or anything, you can find us. I will put the details underneath or in the notes or wherever we can put this as this plays out. Ask us for recommendations. We've always got things to share, so don't hesitate to ask us. In the next session, which we'll be pre-recording as well, we're going to dive deeper into the research and what's in the book and the charts and what we found. But for today, keep learning.
Yeah.